My talk, I hope, is going to complement Peter's. I'm coming at estate regeneration from a slightly different perspective. You've heard quite a lot this morning about lots of different ways of meeting London's shortfall, London's demand for at least 50,000 homes a year. Estate regeneration is part of the mix. And there are widely varying estimates of what the capacity of London's estates is to accommodate additional homes. I think Savills at one point had it at a staggering figure of 400,000. The Centre for London produced a report last week that had it at a more modest 80,000, but these are both big figures. But what we do know is that estate regeneration has become a very controversial subject, and that's why 4 architectural practices, my own, Pollard Thomas Edwards, with PRP, HTA and Levitt Bernstein, produced this report earlier this year, and we joined forces to make a set of recommendations. And I'm only going to be able to touch on the contents of this today. If you're interested, you can find it online, or if you give me your card, I'll get a hard copy sent to you. What I'm going to focus on today is mainly the urban design guidance in our report, and in particular the way in which housing estates tend to form what I call islands of difference, with distinct boundaries and an approach to urbanism and architecture which contrasts with their surroundings. But of course, urban design doesn't exist in a vacuum, so I'm also going to be talking about the political and funding context which has shaped these places and continues to shape attempts to change them. So here's what our former PM actually had to say in January this year. Whether you identify with his rather apocalyptic vision of Britain's worst council estates, or whether you dismiss it as the view from Chipping Norton, it probably encapsulates the beliefs of a large part of the electorate. In the 1960s and 70s, nearly 3 million homes were built by local authorities in Britain, and many of them incorporated new ideas about town planning, about the design of the home, and about methods of construction. And it's these estates which have been and continue to be the main focus of major regeneration initiatives, including Mr. Cameron's declaration of action on so-called sink estates. Like many observers, he believes that non-traditional design is a significant part of the problem. But regeneration specialists know that the issues are far more complex. Most would, however, agree that design can contribute to social and economic success or failure. So my co-author, Andy Gombradsky, is now advising Lord Heseltine's panel on the national strategy for estate regeneration and helping to establish design guidance, which is quite closely based on the principles in altered estates. And I think that will be published over the next few months. These 4 practices behind this report, we've been involved with the regeneration of housing estates for 4 decades, and we started to advise communities and councils on estate improvements soon after the first concrete panel was craned into place, the last one, in the mid-1970s. And since then, we have worked on, under successive political initiatives and funding models, to improve, to remodel, and sometimes to replace dozens of estates in London and around the UK, most of them involving some kind of mixed public and private funding. So we've seen what works and we've seen what doesn't. In part, our report focuses on the crisis of unmet housing demand in London and the South East, but the processes we recommend are relevant across the UK, although the problems and the opportunities elsewhere are very, very different. There's always been tension between the priority to be given to existing residents and the potential of estates to increase housing opportunity for the wider population. But now this has become polarised into 2 fiercely opposed positions, and we heard from Peter some examples of that. So in one corner, we've got those who believe that housing estates belong to those who live on them, and only their views should count in determining the future. And increasingly, they're expressing a preference to be left alone. In the other corner are those who regard housing estates as public assets, which local authorities have not just a right, but a duty to use to meet wider demands and wider needs, including more homes at affordable prices for middle-income households. The views of both of those camps deserve respect. A genuinely balanced community is going to contain a range of housing types and tenures for all sorts of households, across the spectrum of age and ethnicity, income, occupation and size. It's also going to balance the needs of existing communities with the aspirations of what they regard as outsiders who'd like to settle in the area and invest in it if only the opportunity was there. Many residents and their champions in the media think that estate regeneration is no longer delivering balance, that the proportion of affordable to market homes is dwindling, the definition of affordability is shifting, the cost of market homes is soaring, and the buyers of those homes seem like remote aliens, whereas at one time they would be more like people like us with a bit more money. We're far removed from that. And they would condemn estate regeneration, and they do, as social cleansing and a war on social housing. So we need to be really clear about the objective of estate regeneration. Is it to improve the lives of those who live on and around existing estates, or is it to make more effective use of public land to help solve the housing crisis and widen access to home ownership? And our contention is that with care and patience and respect, we can and should be able to do both. The central part of our report, therefore, describes a number of processes which we believe, and we know from practice, can help to reconcile that tension and can deliver more popular and therefore more sustainable outcomes. Now, I don't have time today to go into those. If you're interested, I hope you'll look at the report. But very briefly and in summary, there are two very important sets of processes. One is options appraisal. By that I mean setting out very clearly and methodically a wide range of different possible futures for a particular housing estate given its particular circumstances. And it's important that those options include a serious look at the implications of doing nothing. That may be the best solution in some cases. And the second, of course, is community engagement, which is a subject all of its own, and I regret rushing through it today. But to put it very bluntly, we need to bear in mind right from the start and throughout this process the question, which is going to be on the lips of every resident and every local business, for example, shopkeepers, what's in it for me? And we need an effective and convincing and truthful answer to that. But I'm going to focus today, the time that remains to me, on the only slightly safer ground of design. But I think before we talk about transforming post-war estates, let's remember they're often quite popular when they were first created. And this quote, it's rather charming, bears that out. Older residents, and we talked to lots of them, they remember moving from a slum dwelling to their new centrally heated home with indoor sanitation and a modern kitchen. They blame decline on poor management, physical deterioration and social changes, not necessarily on the original design. Having said that, the experimental nature of post-war housing has failed to adapt successfully to the changing demands that's been put upon it. And in some cases, this has led to Mr. Cameron's bleak picture. It's notable that older estates, for example, those neo-Georgian LCC estates built in the interwar years, have adapted and fared rather better. Efforts to correct the deficiencies of post-war estates began the moment the last ones were completed in the mid-70s, and they've continued ever since. Some have been successful, but others now seem like wasteful examples of treating the symptoms rather than the cause. Those estates which combine failures in urban planning, poor building layout, and physical deterioration ultimately need more radical change, and upgrading could only delay the inevitable. Infill development can also be a good solution, and here's a couple of successful examples, but sometimes it too is a short-term, pragmatic answer. Here's a successful one, Dover Court in Islington. It's a popular estate in a popular location, so it's blessed, but it has a very poor external environment and wasteful areas of underused land, which are now providing sites for around 70 new mixed tenure homes. And of course the high values in this part of London make that possible and make comprehensive public realm transformation also possible. Post-war estates looked to the future, and they often turned their backs on the urban fabric around them. They could be inward-looking, impenetrable, and disconnected from their surroundings. So current best practice in urban design has evolved really in precise reaction to the so-called modernist dogma of post-war estate planning, and it's re-embraced traditional placemaking. So my practice always begins with the process of what we call visible mending. We look for the frayed edges of the pre-existing street pattern, and we lay down a new network of streets and squares which connect them up so that the new blends into its surroundings. This is a Packington estate, which included reinstating historic streets. I hope you can see it quite clearly in the before and after plans, and creating two new London squares. So we've got higher density apartments at the centre of the site, complemented by family houses around the edge, fitting in with the scale of their surroundings. And we even created a neo-traditional housing terrace to complete a fractured Georgian square, which you can see bottom right. Those are brand new, affordable family houses. Transforming an estate into a connected neighbourhood is much more than a design process. It challenges the perception of the estate as a place apart and its residents as different from their neighbours. This is a very sensitive issue. Many residents are fearful of barriers being taken down and thus losing their identity as an estate. I wanted to talk also about invisible estates, but I'm conscious of the time and lunch pressing, so I'm going to maybe save that for another talk. But there are lessons here about estates that you don't even notice and which are now, I'm afraid, being dismantled through compulsory sell-offs. Last year, this same group of architects collaborated on another report, which you may have seen, called Superdensity, the sequel. Again, that's available online if you want to have a look at it. And this explains how to create successful neighbourhoods at high density, but it also cautions against what we call hyperdensity, which is above the top end of the London Plan guidance. And it focuses on the importance of street-based urban design in the creation of mixed communities, and the advantages of mid-rise over high-rise development when it comes to integrating different tenures and the control of management costs. So this case study, which is one of a dozen in that report, achieves a super density of 350 homes per hectare. That's very high, but it's only 7 stories. It includes houses as well as apartments. It includes commercial space as well as residential. And separate but identical entrances for market and affordable apartments achieve tenure integration but enable effective management. All of this has become very relevant to estate regeneration. Post-war estates were often built to a low density. We've heard about that from Peter. And that was a time when urban populations were falling. Remember, London's population was falling. And this potentially allows them today to be updated in ways that create many more homes, as well as a better place. But the reduction of public investment means that providing new affordable homes on estates is becoming mainly or entirely dependent on cross-subsidy from homes for sale. And therefore, densities are being pushed up to create enough surplus with the risk that some outcomes could be unsustainable in the long term. Building new homes for market sale on estates has become the established way of meeting the social objective of home ownership, as well as the practical demand for more homes and the financial need to fund change through cross-subsidy from the market. And it's been shown to work, but now it's coming under pressure. We need to continue that work and that process, but widen the mix of what we're providing still further, and let's base it on local need rather than generic planning targets or national policy objectives. Different tenures are occupied in different ways, and it's a challenge to design for their integration and practical management. But we need to be realistic about the need for separate entrances, forget the rhetoric around poor doors. It's a very simplistic reaction to a complex issue. I'm going to just wrap up. I'm being waved at now. We'll forgive the government its policy conflicts today. But I thought it was quite useful just to end on two examples of different funding models and the effect they have on place. The Housing Action Trust in the mid-1990s were a high point for grant funding and for community regeneration. They were lavishly funded. It's absolutely unthinkable today, but what they do show is what can be achieved through government investment in rented housing. By contrast, these new council homes, which were finished just a couple of years ago, built with no grant, no cross-subsidy, funded by overseas investment, secured against the rental stream. These are embarking. Other councils have been reluctant to take on the long-term obligations of this model, but it does illustrate that UK council housing is regarded by the market as a positive asset. So, in conclusion, let's hear more about investment, less about subsidy, and let's use this valuable commodity to improve conditions for existing residents and to create additional homes for a more diverse population. Thank you.